The citation was still flapping against my boat when I realized the people finding me were already fishing my water, the plastic tag snapping in the morning breeze, while a dozen lines cut across the glassy surface of the lake behind my house. Coffee still warm in my hand, mist rolling low over the shoreline, and Margaret Whitmore stood at the end of my dock like she was hosting a community event, clipboard tucked under her arm, pastel windbreaker catching the sunrise, telling two retirees where to cast for base as if she owned the entire shoreline, the smell of damp cedar and outboard fuel hanging in the air. While my aluminum boat rocked gently against the cleats, I bolted into that dock myself, and the yellow notice zip-tied to the rail read, "Unauthorized watercraft community violation, $250 per day," which would have been funny if it wasn't attached to property my grandfather bought before this neighborhood even existed. I stepped closer and heard the low hum of electric trolling motors. Slicing through the quiet, someone laughing about a 5-pounder near the North Cove, another neighbor dragging a cooler across the planks that creaked under the extra weight, and Margaret glanced at me with that practiced HOA smile, the kind that looks friendly until you notice the pen already poised to write another fine. She told me the lake was now classified as shared community water, that my boat disrupted aesthetics, that residents had purchased seasonal fishing access approved by the board, and I remember tasting that metallic edge of disbelief as I looked across 80 acres of water reflecting the pale sky. Every ripple familiar, every tree line burned into my memory from summers spent learning to cast beside my grandfather. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just followed her gesture as she pointed to a laminated map showing my shoreline colored in the same shade as the rest of the subdivision. And behind her, 3 teenagers dropped lines off the corner of my dock, their tackle boxes scraping the boards I sealed last fall. One of them asking if the deeper water near the old stone marker held catfish, and Margaret nodded like a tour guide, telling them the community planned a weekend fishing tournament, prizes, food trucks, maybe even a small stage near the gravel pull-off that sits squarely on my parcel. The morning sun burned through the mist, lighting up the water like polished glass, and I noticed something else. New signs stacked near her golf cart. White plastic, still wrapped, probably reading community lake access, ready to be planted along my shoreline. And that's when the quiet settled in, the kind that comes before you realize everyone around you is confidently wrong, because the lake they were claiming, the dock they were standing on, the water their lines disappeared into, every inch of it, traced back to a deed older than the first house built here. And while Margaret started explaining daily penalties for noncompliance, I folded the citation, slid it into my pocket, and watched another bobber drift across water that didn't belong to any HOA. Not now, not ever. By noon, the lake sounded different. Not quiet and familiar, but crowded, like someone had turned my backyard into a public park overnight. Folding chairs scraping gravel, the hiss of a portable grill, kids skipping stones off the same shallow shelf where my grandfather taught me how to read the water, and I stood on the porch watching sunlight flash off a dozen fishing lines stretched across water I knew down to the inch. Every submerged stump, every drop off, every narrow channel that curved. Along the east bank, the cedar boards beneath my boots still damp from the morning mist, while a pontoon boat I had never seen before idled 20 yards from my dock, its electric motor humming low, a cooler thumping against aluminum as someone shouted about the best spot near the old willow. And I could smell sunscreen mixing with lake mud, hear the clink of tackle boxes opening, the splash of a lure landing exactly where I used to anchor my boat on calm evenings, and it felt less like trespassing and more like they genuinely believed this place belonged to them, which was the most surreal part. Margaret had not just issued fines, she had rewritten reality. She drove past in her white golf cart, tires crunching over my gravel turnout, slowing just enough to wave like we were partners hosting a community event, a stack of printed permits fluttering on the passenger seat. She handed one to a neighbor standing knee-deep at the shoreline, explaining that fishing access was included with monthly dues, her voice calm, rehearsed, confident, and I noticed new stakes pushed into the grass along the waterline, thin metal rods marking what she called designated casting zones, each one planted squarely inside boundaries I had walked since I was 10 years old. The breeze picked up and rippled the surface, sunlight breaking into shattered reflections, and I remembered my grandfather unfolding the original survey map on this same porch, tracing the property line with a calloused finger. telling me the lake was not just scenery, but responsibility. 80 acres of water, full shoreline rights, everything from the gravel ramp to the narrow inlet on the north end. Back then it felt like a story from another time, something too big to matter in a quiet neighborhood. But now I watched someone hammer a sign into the ground that read community fishing area, and the hollow metallic tap echoed across the cove. I could feel the weight of it settling. Not anger, just the slow realization that every cast, every chair, every cooler resting on my grass was building a case they thought was already settled. And Margaret stopped at the end of my dock again, scribbling notes while measuring the distance between my cleats and the waterline. She mentioned dock compliance, seasonal usage, possible removal if violations continued, her pen scratching paper while a bobber drifted past her reflection, and I leaned against the railing, listening to the hum of trolling motors and the distant laughter carrying across water that had always been quiet. Knowing the louder it got, the easier it would be to prove exactly where they were standing when the map finally came out. The first certified letter arrived before sunset, tucked into my mailbox with that stiff official paper that always smells faintly of fresh toner and authority. And I knew it was from Margaret before I even opened it, because the lake was still buzzing behind me, with evening anglers casting into the orange reflection of the sky, while her golf cart idled near the shoreline. The envelope crackled as I unfolded 3 pages of violations: unauthorized watercraft, non-compliant dock structure, obstruction of designated community fishing zones, each one stamped with a fine amount and a deadline measured in days instead of weeks. And the air carried the sound of a spinnerbait slicing through the water, followed by someone cheering like they had just landed a tournament winner, which made the numbers on that paper feel even more surreal. I leaned against the mailbox post, reading that my dock must be removed or modified to meet HOA guidelines, that my boat must be relocated to approved storage, that failure to comply would result in escalating penalties. And I glanced up to see a neighbor tying off to my cleat without hesitation, his rope rubbing against what I sealed last fall. The low creak echoing over the water while Margaret walked the shoreline with a clipboard, stopping every few yards to speak with residents, pointing toward the deeper channel near the north bank as if she had studied it for years. The smell of charcoal drifted across the cove as someone fired up a grill near the gravel ramp, the smoke rising in thin blue ribbons, and I noticed laminated badges hanging from lanyards around a few necks. Community fishing permits printed in bold letters, which meant she had already monetized something she did not own. The sun dipped lower, turning the lake copper, and I unfolded the final page, which referenced a weekend fishing tournament scheduled for Saturday morning, registration fees collected, temporary signage approved, expected attendance over 50 residents, and I could hear them already planning it. Someone measuring space for folding tables, another marking parking areas along my shoreline with orange cones, the plastic clicking against rocks, and Margaret paused at the end of my dock again, explaining to a couple where the weigh-in station might go, her pen tapping the paper while she balanced carefully on boards she had just declared non-compliant. The irony sat quietly in the air, heavy as the humidity settling over the water. I folded the letter slowly, feeling the thickness of it, then watched a teenager cast from the exact spot where my grandfather once anchored a small wooden boat, the line arcing cleanly into the fading light. And I realized the fines were not meant to stop me. They were meant to normalize everything happening around me, to make the lake look communal long enough that nobody questioned it. The trolling motors hummed, bobbers drifted, and Margaret's voice carried across the surface, describing prize categories for largest base and heaviest stringer, while I slid the letter into my pocket and listened, because the more plans they made, the clearer the map in my head became. Every chair, every sign, every rope tied to my dock, quietly documenting where they believed they had permission to stand. Saturday morning arrived with the low rumble of pickup trucks lining the gravel edge of the shoreline, headlights cutting across the water before the sun cleared the trees, and I stepped onto the porch to the smell of fresh coffee mixing with gasoline and lake mud, while folding tables unfolded one by one along my grass, metal legs clicking into place, coolers thudding down beside them, and a banner stretched between 2 stakes that read Community Lake Fishing Tournament in bold blue letters. The fabric snapping in the breeze like it had been here for years. Margaret moved through the crowd with a clipboard and a plastic megaphone, her voice carrying across the cove as she assigned launch order, explaining way and times, reminding everyone to respect shoreline boundaries that she had drawn herself, and the sound of trolling motors flicked on in sequence, a soft electric chorus spreading across the surface. Boats drifting from every direction toward the deeper channel near my dock. Someone dragging a measuring board across the planks, another tying a rope to my cleat again without asking. The knot tightened with a practiced pull, and I watched the water fill with wakes that overlapped like ripples in a crowded marina, sunlight finally breaking over the tree line, turning the mist into gold while bobbers scattered across the lake. A teenager laughed when his lure landed close to the old stone marker, exactly where my grandfather once told me the depth dropped from 6 feet to 15, and Margaret walked down the shoreline placing small numbered flags into the ground, marking way and positions, each flag pressed into soil I had seeded last spring, the plastic stems bending slightly before settling upright. She announced prize categories: largest base, longest stringer, youth division, her megaphone squealing softly with feedback, and I noticed a portable scale being hung from the beam of my dock, its metal hook swinging slowly over the water, the breeze carrying the smell of sunscreen and grilled sausage, folding chairs creaking as spectators settled in, and a line formed near the registration table where envelopes exchanged hands, bills sliding into a cash box labeled Lake Maintenance Fund. The irony, so quiet it almost disappeared under the chatter. I leaned against the railing and listened to them debate which coves held better structure, which bank warmed faster in the sun, all of it spoken with ownership, with certainty, as if the lake had always belonged to them. And Margaret stepped onto the dock again, tapping the scale to steady it, explaining where fish would be measured, her shoes leaving faint dust prints across boards she had already fined me for. The water lapped gently against the posts, reflecting the movement like a mirror, and boats spread farther out, casting lines that stitched the lake into sections, every ripple documented in my mind. Every anchor dropped exactly where the survey lines ran beneath the surface. The tournament horn finally sounded from her megaphone, a long electronic tone echoing across 80 acres of water, and I folded my arms, watching 50 residents celebrate the opening cast on a lake they believed was community property, while the quiet certainty settled in that they had just gathered exactly where the boundaries mattered most. By mid-morning, the dock felt like a way station, the metal scale clinking each time someone lifted a fish toward the hook, while Margaret called out numbers in a steady rhythm. 2 pounds 8 ounces, 3 pounds even, her voice echoing over water that had once carried nothing but wind and distant birds, and I stood at the edge watching wet footprints spread across the boards, coolers opening and closing, the smell of lake water mixing with sunscreen and grilled onions drifting from the shoreline, the banner snapping above them, registration envelopes stacking beside the cash box, and every few minutes another boat idled in, prop wash rippling against my posts, someone tying off to my cleat again with a casual tug, as if the knot belonged there, as if this had always been their launch point. Margaret moved efficiently, marking a clipboard, handing out colored tags for qualifying fish, reminding participants to stay within community lake boundaries, and each time she said it, I noticed how confidently she gestured across the entire surface. 80 acres reduced to a single phrase, community lake. The words floated in the air like they had legal weight, and I watched a man step onto the shallow bank near the stone marker, planting a folding chair right on the line I knew marked the original shoreline survey. He pushed the legs into damp soil, leaning back with a thermos. Completely unaware, he was sitting on a boundary that mattered more than anything Margaret had printed. The sun climbed higher, glare flashing off aluminum hulls, and someone shouted about a 5-pound base near the north inlet. Boats converged slowly, trolling motors humming, wakes overlapping like intersecting threads, and Margaret announced that afternoon weigh-ins would continue until 3, prizes awarded at 4. She tapped the scale again, the hook swinging gently above the water, and I noticed she had taped a laminated sign to the post reading official tournament dock, the adhesive curling slightly in the heat, the plastic rustling softly each time a breeze passed through. I could hear the click of camera phones, families taking pictures, kids holding up small fish with proud smiles, and the entire scene settled into something that looked permanent, chairs anchored, flags planted, ropes tied, The kind of visual proof that makes people believe ownership follows activity, not paper. I leaned against the railing and listened to Margaret explain. Future plans, monthly fishing passes, seasonal events, maybe even a floating platform near the deeper channel. Her pen scratching notes as if she was designing infrastructure on land she had already claimed, and the quiet realization deepened. The more organized it became, the more measurable it became. Every flag, every table, every anchored boat creating a record in plain sight. Sunlight burned across the lake, flattening shadows, and I watched a participant step carefully onto the dock with a dripping net, water pooling at his feet. He asked where to place his catch. Margaret pointed to the center beam, directly over the section where the original survey pin sat below the boards, and I followed the drip of water running toward the edge, falling back into the lake in slow drops, each one echoing softly, because by then the entire tournament had settled exactly where the boundaries converged, and none of them realized how precise their celebration had become. The sun reached its highest point just as Margaret announced final calls for weigh-in, her voice steady through the megaphone while boats angled back toward my dock in slow procession, trolling motors whining softly, coolers sloshing with lake water, and I watched the shoreline fill tighter, folding chairs shifting closer, spectators stepping down the bank to get a better view, the grass flattening under sneakers, the smell of warm plastic and sunscreen thick in the air. Someone balanced a clipboard on the hood of a truck parked partly on the gravel ramp my grandfather poured decades ago, and another participant planted a measuring board directly beside the old stone marker, its faded surface barely visible under the bright orange flags Margaret had placed earlier. She called out standings, largest base just over 5 pounds, youth division leading at 2 pounds 11 ounces, and the crowd leaned in, conversations overlapping, phones raised, the dock creaking under the extra weight while the scale hook swung gently in the breeze. I noticed how every rope tightened, every anchor set, boats holding position across the deeper channel, and the lake looked stitched together with lines, a quiet grid forming over water that had never needed boundaries until now. Margaret flipped another page on her clipboard, explaining that monthly access would begin next week, that residents could reserve shoreline sections, her pen tapping the paper as if assigning future ownership, and I watched a volunteer tape. A printed schedule to the post beside the scale, the corners curling in the heat, the word community repeated in bold letters, repeated enough times that it sounded official, repeated enough that nobody questioned it. The sun reflected hard off the surface, forcing everyone to squint, and I stepped down onto the dock slowly, boards warm under my boots, the scale swaying above the exact midpoint where the original survey pin sat beneath the planks. Margaret nodded politely as I approached, assuming I was finally participating, and another participant handed her a dripping net, water pattering onto the boards, the sound rhythmic, steady. She read the weight aloud while the crowd murmured approval, and I glanced across the lake, boats spaced evenly, lines still in the water, flags planted along the bank, tables stacked with registration forms, cash box half open, everything arranged with careful confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from believing permission already exists. And the breeze shifted, carrying the faint rustle of the banner overhead, the word tournament snapping once before settling. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt the folded papers I had carried all morning, heavier than the citation, heavier than the schedule, because while Margaret prepared to announce winners, the entire shoreline, every chair, every rope, every anchor sat exactly where the original parcel lines converged, and none of them noticed how quiet I had become while the lake, they claimed, reflected the moment. Back in perfect stillness, Margaret lifted the megaphone again, and the chatter softened into a loose semicircle around the dock. Coolers closed, rods leaned against chairs, the scale still swaying gently above the boards while sunlight reflected off the water like polished glass. She began announcing third place, her voice calm and practiced, and I stepped forward just enough that my boots touched the damp patch beneath the hook, the wood warm from the afternoon heat. Someone shifted to give me space, assuming I was just another spectator, and I pulled the folded papers from my pocket, the edges worn from being handled all day, the faint smell of old ink mixing with sunscreen and lake water. Margaret glanced at me briefly but kept reading weights, her pen tapping the clipboard, and I unfolded the first page slowly, the crackle loud in the quiet that settled between announcements. A breeze lifted the banner behind us, the word community fluttering once before falling still, and I held the survey map open against the railing, lines stretching across the lake in precise angles, shoreline boundaries traced in heavy black, the exact midpoint marked directly beneath the beam holding the scale. Someone leaned closer, squinting at the paper. Another participant stepped up from the gravel, boots crunching softly, and Margaret paused mid-sentence. Noticing the crowd shifting, I set the second document beside the map, the deed dated decades earlier. Parcel description matching the waterline they had filled all. Morning, 80 acres described in measured detail, shoreline rights included, access restricted to owner permission. The words plain, legal, unmistakable, and the lake behind us fell quieter, trolling motors idling down as people drifted closer, the smell of grilled food fading into still air. Margaret lowered the megaphone slowly, her expression tightening just enough to show calculation. She leaned toward the papers, reading, her pen hovering above the clipboard, and I traced a finger along the boundary line running directly through the dock, past the stone marker, across the deeper channel where half the boats were anchored. The realization moved through the group without sound. Chairs creaked as someone stood, a rope slipped from a cleat and splashed lightly into the water, and the laminated sign taped to the post rustled as the breeze shifted again. I flipped to the final page. The recorded survey coordinates matching the stakes beneath the grass, the same. Ground holding their tables, their flags, their cash box, and Margaret looked up from the document to the lake, then back to the lines, her earlier confidence replaced by careful silence. Because the scale hanging above us, the dock under our feet, and every cast line stretching across the water now aligned with the boundaries printed in black ink. And I rested the papers flat on the railing while the lake reflected the moment back in complete stillness. The quiet spread across the dock in slow waves, conversations dropping to murmurs while Margaret read the parcel description again, her finger tracing the boundary that ran beneath the scale and across the water filled with anchored boats. And someone near the shoreline stepped back from the orange flag as if distance might change the line. The breeze softened, flattening the banner above us, and the lake suddenly looked wider, emptier. Like everyone was seeing it for the first time, I tapped the survey map lightly, the paper rustling, and pointed toward the deeper channel where half the participants still drifted, their lines cutting across water now framed by the black boundary lines. One trolling motor clicked off, then another, the hum fading into stillness. Margaret lowered her clipboard slowly, eyes moving from the map to the chairs planted along the grass, to the tables stacked with envelopes, to the rope tied to my cleat. And I slid the final document forward, a simple notice granting private access at owner discretion. The language plain, the implication heavier than anything said out loud. The laminated community sign taped to the post fluttered once, then settled, and a participant carefully lifted it, reading, then glancing at the map again. The scale hook swayed gently above us, reflecting sunlight in a slow arc. Someone untied their boat without a word, the rope slipping free and dropping softly into the water, the knot loosening as if it had never belonged there. Margaret cleared her throat, her megaphone still hanging at her side, but she did not raise it. She studied the map one more time, measuring distances with her eyes, recalculating, the crowd shifting subtly, chairs folding halfway, coolers closing, the smell of grilled food replaced by the neutral scent of warm lake air. I spoke quietly, not louder than the breeze, explaining that access to the water required permission, that organized events would need approval, that the dock and shoreline fell within private boundaries. The words carried calmly, and the lake reflected the moment back in still glass. The boats drifting farther from the center line, lines reeled in one by one. Margaret finally set the clipboard down on the table, her earlier confidence replaced by careful silence, and the orange flags planted along the bank suddenly looked temporary, like placeholders waiting to be removed. Sunlight shifted west, shadows stretching across the grass, and the entire tournament arrangement felt suspended, every table, every chair, every anchor now resting inside lines they had never checked, and I folded the papers slowly, leaving the map open just long enough for everyone to see the boundaries converge exactly where they had gathered all day. The first chair folded with a hollow snap that echoed farther than expected. and then another followed, the rhythm spreading quietly along the shoreline while boats drifted backward from the dock, trolling motors humming at low speed. Lines reeled in one by one, the water clearing in slow arcs as if the lake itself was exhaling. Margaret stood beside the table with her clipboard resting flat, the banner above her sagging slightly as the breeze shifted, and someone peeled the laminated community sign from the post, the adhesive stretching before releasing with a soft crackle. The scale hook continued its gentle sway over empty boards, reflecting sunlight in a narrow flash each time it turned. Coolers lifted, folding legs clicked closed, and the orange flags planted in the grass began disappearing, pulled free and stacked in a quiet pile. I watched a participant untie the last rope from my cleat, the line coiling loosely into his hands, leaving the wood bare again. The smell of grilled food faded as the portable grill cooled, replaced by the clean scent of warm water and cedar. Margaret gathered the printed permits slowly, aligning the edges, her earlier certainty replaced by careful movements, and she glanced once more across the lake where only a few boats remained, idling near the deeper channel, their wakes fading into glass. I slid the folded deed back into my pocket, the paper warm from the sun, and stepped off the dock onto the grass where footprints already softened. Back into the ground. The shoreline looked wider without tables, without chairs, without stakes marking sections that never existed. Someone carried the banner away, the fabric brushing the gravel with a faint rustle, and the space where the weigh-in station stood returned to open ground. Margaret finally spoke in a quieter tone, acknowledging that access would need review, that future events would require coordination. Her words measured, practical, and the crowd thinned as trucks pulled away from the gravel, tires crunching slowly, the sound diminishing into distance. The lake settled again, only small ripples lapping against the posts, and I stepped back onto the dock, feeling the boards steady beneath my boots, the hook now hanging still above clear water, the stone marker visible again just below the surface, sunlight angled west, stretching long reflections across 80 acres that looked exactly as they had before the morning began. A single boat glided toward the far bank, then shut off its motor, drifting quietly, and the last cooler lifted into a truck bed with a muted thud. Margaret walked past me with the clipboard tucked under her arm, nodding once, her shoes leaving faint dust prints that faded as she reached the gravel. And when the final vehicle disappeared down the road, the lake returned to silence. No flags, no ropes, no banner, just calm water and the soft creak of the dock settling back into place. And I stood there listening to the wind move across property lines that no longer needed explaining.